Hello, and welcome to a bonus episode of WrestleRotica. This week we travel from the squared circle to a galaxy far, far away. In this bonus episode, we have one story to share with you. The story is entitled Padme and the Pleasure Pit, a prequel slave story. Padme Amidala strays from her group on Tatooine and is quickly captured by Jabba's bodyguard, Aurra Sing. Sing then brings Padme to her master, Jabba the Hutt's Pleasure Pit. In Jabba's Pleasure Pit, anything goes, as Padme quickly finds out. Without further ado, let's get to this story.
Patience!
This story is entitled Padme and the Pleasure Pit, a prequel slave story, and it was written by Master Jabba. Padme stopped in mid-sentence. It was not the floppy-haired amphibian that stood behind her, but someone she had never seen before. It was a short female, humanoid, with a pasty white complexion. Long flowing orange and red hair cascaded from a lone crest on the woman's otherwise shaven head. Her taut muscular physique was clad in a tight orange leotard, and a vast array of gun-filled holsters hung around her waist. Her elongated, slender fingers caressed the guns like they were lovers. It was the long rifle that hung from her right shoulder that worried Padme the most. The female's black ringed eyes penetrated Padme with a glare that startled the queen to her feet. "What are you doing here, young one?" commanded the woman. "Are you here for the Hutt's Pleasure Pit?"
Oh yeah!
Before Padme gathered her response, she felt the impact of the woman's words hit her, with one taking particular prominence, the word being Hutt. All her life, Padme had been aware of the rotund, slug-like rulers of Nahata, and yet she had never seen one in the flesh. Her royal advisors had frowned upon any suggestion of an expedition to their world. They would not even allow any of her decoys to survey the world. Padme had been raised upon stories of the Hutts, of their cruelty, their cunning and most worrying for a pretty young female, their appetites, both culinary and sexual. She had long heard myths of unfortunate girls who had been sold to Hutts as slaves, forced to dress half naked and submit to their masters' every desire, a course that usually led to their deaths. As memories of these tales filled her mind, Padme recalled the words she had overheard Panaka speak to the Jedi Qui-Gon Jinn as they had approached the Hutt-ruled planet Tatooine. "You can't take her royal highness there! The Hutts are gangsters! If they discovered her on board, there's no telling what they would do." Padme had a worrying concern that she was about to find out exactly what would happen if the Hutts did discover her. "Speak, girl! Are you mute?" inquired the pasty-skinned female. Padme felt that honesty and vulnerability were the best ways out of this situation. "No, I'm just lost. My friends are back in the main hangar, and I was hoping that you could point me back towards that direction." The pale female paused, and her dark eyes looked deeper into Padme's. "My, you're a pretty one to be here lost all alone on your own," she whispered. For reasons Padme couldn't understand, she felt her soft lips open and speak in accordance. "My, I am a pretty one to be here lost all on my own. Perhaps you should follow I, Aurra Sing, Jabba's chief of security," voiced the orange-haired female. "Perhaps I should follow you, Aurra Sing, Jabba's chief of security," repeated Padme. At this moment, her surroundings felt like a dream to Padme, and she couldn't determine if she were awake or if Aurra were a hallucination. Temporarily, she forgot her caution about the Hutts being so near. Aura's long, slender fingers began to stroke Padme's left cheek as she whispered her final words into Padme's lobeless ear. "Then again, perhaps it would be best if you went to sleep for the moment, until the Pleasure Pit is ready. Then again, perhaps it would be best if I were to sleep for the moment, until the Pleasure Pit is ready," repeated the young queen, barely acknowledging the words that she was speaking. Gently she felt her soft eyelashes close together, and darkness clouded her field of view. When Padme awoke, Aurra Sing was the last thing on her mind. Disorientated, her first thought concerned the moist, sticky sensation she felt against her belly and her breast. She was naked, and the coldness of this strange gel caused goosebumps to form over her tender, creamy skin. She tried to recall at which point she had been stripped of her clothes, but had no recollection of events since meeting Aura. She placed her fingers to her eyes in order to rub the sleep from her soft eyelids. She tried to take a deep breath in the process, and was alarmed at the tightness around her windpipe as she did so. Something cold and metallic was digging into her neck, and it rattled as she lifted her body from the sticky substance beneath her. Padme's long brown hair fell about her face. It was still braided for the most part, but sections were unkempt and ragged. She pushed it from her eyes, hair sticking to the thick green substance that covered her fingers. She looked down, and the first thing she noticed was the gold train that trailed from her neck. The sensual pleasure about her windpipe was courtesy of a thick metal collar. Padme looked at the binding, but with little success. Instead, her eyes followed the path of the chain in front of her. The floor around Amidala was as moist as the section beneath her, and its transparency reflected her beautiful face back at her, gazing back as she stared forward. As she followed the chain further, she saw events around her, and slowly, the full horror of her current circumstances hit her like a sledgehammer. She was currently in some kind of concave pit. She attempted to crawl on her hands, but thanks to the pit's oily floor, only slid further towards the center of the sandstone construct. The imprisonment would have been enough were it not for the events that were going on around the Queen. She had awoken in the middle of the most vivid orgy of sexual activity she had ever seen. All about her, creatures from across the Republic and the Outer Rim territories were indulging in perversions the likes of which she had never witnessed. Upon viewing the two glistening, bulbous creatures before her, Amidala felt the bile fill up in the back of her tightened throat as she realized the full danger of her situation. The worst had happened. She was now a prisoner of the Hutts. The very sight of the green, slimy Hutts sickened Padme. They were a testimony to everything that revolted her in the universe. She adored the cleanliness of the soft water she poured onto her soft skin each day. And the gentle smell of roses that a bath gave her. The Hutts were grimy and smelled of a thick, musty scent that was laced with a hint of raw fish, which she could smell even from this distance. She prided herself on the firmness of her prime athletic figure and the discipline that had gained it. The Hutts were a tribute to sloth. Their rotund, fat bodies and tails filling up much of this pit. Padme tried to claw at the floor to stop her journey, but it was so slippery from all the secretions smeared across it that she was unable to get a grip. Breathing had been a problem for her since arriving at this despicable place, but now it was impossible. She was choking, and she feared it could be the death of her. She closed her eyes so as to shield herself from the horror, but then her journey stopped as she felt her tender face impact on something soft and warm, moist and sticky, but warm all the same. As a salty taste filled her lips and the thick fishy smell enraptured her nostrils, she knew instantly where she had arrived. Confused, Padme attempted to crawl away, but her regal pride would not let her do so, not even in a situation such as this. Instead, she rose from the moist ground, her bare feet practically stuck to the rich substance beneath them. She turned around and opened her eyes. What greeted her was far worse than she had anticipated. Up close, the first thing that struck Padme about the Hutt was the size of his mouth. She knew that Hutts would eat everything and anything. Humans were a rare delicacy to them, and so she did not know if this was to be her final destination. The Hutt had no real lips, yet where they should have been was a vast cascade of rich, creamy saliva. A constant stream oozed from the creature's mouth, and this alone was enough to make Padme vomit. She couldn't bear to look at this monstrosity. Instead, she looked down upon her tiny naked form and felt shame when comparing herself to the vastness of what was before her. Padme stared at her naked body, possibly for the first time since reaching puberty. She was no longer a child, but she was far from being a woman. Her breasts were but small swellings upon her chest. The only sign of her growth was the increased size of the areolas around her nipples, which were now a darkened pink color. As she looked down further to her pale belly, with its layer of puppy fat, and to her straight and even hips, she was aware that she was yet to receive the feminine curves that signaled the arrival of womanhood. She glared further down to the bulging Venus mound that lay at the center of her crotch. It was for the most part still bald, save for a few wispy, brown pubic hairs that entwined themselves around her soft pink vaginal opening. Ashamed of this almost androgynous state in which she appeared, Padme closed her long, shapeless legs and cradled her thin, straight arms about her body. Hair laid bare and naked before the hut, the young queen felt gawky and awkward. Aww. Captain Parnarca's words back on the ship continued to echo through her mind like a curse. Next she heard Aurra Sing's voice. "See, Jabba! I told you she was a beauty!" Jabba looked upon the young human female before him, and his tail began to thrash excitedly against the ground. His bounty hunter, come bodyguard, had done well this time. This was a prime example of a young human female, obviously not raised on the bitter, sand-swept plains of Tatooine. The smooth peaches and cream tone of her skin was no doubt the product of a life spent on one of the cooler worlds. He looked forward to soaking the pretty young thing's long brown hair with the life-giving properties of his juicy saliva. Her pretty round, cherubic face was perfect for licking with his sensuous tongue, and he ached to see her features dripping with his green love juice. Her body was a treat to him, her breast and stomach so tight as to not get in the way of his eager little hands. Jabba had already noticed how supple the cheeks of her pale behind were. He loved the soft, humid taste of a human female's anal passage.
No shit.
And couldn't wait to get inside its clammy tightness. The jewel in this gift lay between the girl's legs. She was obviously still in her youth, and her soft pink vaginal opening had only been penetrated a few times, if at all, ensuring that the small creature would be tight and firm around his gigantic, thrusting tail. She was obviously tender, being as young as she was, but when he had bored of her, he was sure she would make an appetizing delicacy. With this thought, Jabba began to drool even more intensely. Here she was before him, captured at the perfect moment between girl and woman. He wanted her with deep desire. Padme looked into his snake-like eyes and knew this also. And she was very afraid. So afraid that she felt the muscles of her urethra contract. From between her legs, a golden shower spurted forward, splashing onto Jabba's belly, its drips flying in all directions. She feared this action might be the death of her. Instead, Jabba's long, dripping tongue rolled from between his lips, down to his gut, and licked up the last of Padme's urinal treat. His tongue returned to his mouth, and he licked his lips in approval. This action revolted Amidala. If he was willing to drink any of her bodily fluids, what did he expect her to consume from him in return? Yet she stood upright in front of Jabba, when he wanted her to kneel before him in complete submission. She had a proud streak, and if Jabba were to do unto her as he so desired, he would have to break her will. Ignoring for this moment Aurra Sing, who still sat astride his tail, massaging the thick grooves of his hide with her long, sensuous fingers, Jabba gestured to a Gamorrean guard that stood idly nearby. Walking towards Padme, the guard was clad only in a pair of furry briefs, his bulky green, muscular frame towering over the tiny monarch of Naboo. Jabba barked an order to the guard and Hutsies. A concerned Padme then watched the Gamorrean remove his trunks. The pig creature's manhood was itself a surprise, not as long as Padme had anticipated. In fact, about the length of a human male's penis. Yet its girth was huge, at least as thick as her forearm, if not bigger. Standing behind Padme, the brute pushed her to the ground. Amidala felt the pain in her right elbow as it broke her fall. The Gamorrean gripped Padme tightly around the waist as she attempted to crawl away, still slipping on the slimy floor. The guard had the queen in its vice-like grip, and she knew what was coming. She had hoped this moment would have come later, rather than sooner, possibly with the right person. Saddened by what was about to happen, at the loss of innocence that was ahead, tears began to flood down her soft little cheeks, and she could taste their salty flavor as they dripped down to her lips. Padme looked back into Jabba's wide, repulsive face, and noticed a smile that had begun to peek across her lipless mouth. She closed her eyes and opened her legs as wide as possible. She feared that this might be painful, but she would do what she must to get through the moment. Her clitoris was bulging for reasons she did not quite understand, and she hoped that the juicy walls of her vagina were lubricated enough to take the incoming green intruder with as little agony as possible. Then a horrible thought crossed Padme's mind. Gamorrean guards impregnated the females via their anus. Filling the supple cheeks at the opening to her back passage forced apart, Padme opened wide the soft tiny lips of her mouth and screamed.
I shouldn't have done that.
Padme was so numb with shock that at first she didn't even feel the pain of the Gamorrean's bulging manhood filling the entirety of the tight crevice that led to her rectum. As he removed his love weapon and thrust it once more between her buttocks, the full force of the agony hit her like nothing she had known before. The tight pink tissue of her back passage was stretched as wide as possible, and in this agony, the queen clenched her teeth tight together and cried bitter tears, so as not to give the guard the satisfaction of her screams. Yet Padme was in pain, and she wanted him to stop. He was practically pushing her onto his erect weapon in such a manner that even whilst thrusting into her, his stumpy erection stayed inside her tight rectum at all times. The ground beneath her was so moist that the force of the creature was pushing the queen forward and onto Jabba's slimy gut, and all she could taste was the Hutt's salty secretions. Padme could feel the tip of the guard's penis puncturing her bowel, and this worried her. She was now adjusting to the constant state of agony, and was beginning to notice the sensation she felt as the Gamorrean's manhood rubbed against the back of her prostate.
Oh my god, it feels so good, oh yeah.
And this concerned her even more, for she was enjoying its pulsing sensations. The pig creature was slobbering, and his rich bubbling saliva was cascading into Amidala's deep brown hair. He moved closer to her face, and she felt the moistness of his dribble pour into her lobeless air as his grunts vibrated through her skull. The experience was thoroughly revolting. By now, the spectacle of this pretty young human female being violated in an unlikely orifice was attracting quite a crowd within the pit. Gons, Twi'leks, Rodians, they all had gathered around Padme and the Gamorrean. Most were chanting, and some of the males had even begun to masturbate at this arousing sight. Jabba himself was extremely excited. Soon this arrogant young human would be broken.
Delete!
And would be his for the taking. Full of passion, the girth of his gigantic tail beat against the ground. Padme's anal passage was stretched to breaking point, and she could barely take any more punishment from the Gamorrean. Her rectal tissue was red raw, and by now, an Amidala was concerned about possible damage to her internal organs, should she survive this experience. That she could barely breathe thanks to the color that embraced her neck only caused her further worry. Then the Gamorrean stopped. Padme was in such torment, and her rectum was so numb, that she did not even realize until a few seconds later. Tepidly, she looked behind her. The Gamorrean gripped his stiff, glove organ between his rotund fingers and aimed it at Amidala's kneeling form. The force of his ejaculation hit Padme square in the crease of her back, and with such force that it pushed her to the ground. This rich, creamy shower of cum smeared over her back and saturated her hair. Several thick, white drops flew onto her innocent, cherubic face, dripping down her chin. The gathered crowd roared with their approval. Those that had been pulling at their manhoods let go. From all directions, Padme was bathed in a sea of gooey cum, that dripped across the entirety of her tiny young form. Some semen was green, others yellow. There was even pale blue love juice, all flowing down this naked monarch's post-pubescent body. Amidala felt utterly humiliated, as had been Jabba's plan. The Hutt himself let rip with a vile thunder of Huttese laughter. Still drenched in a vast mixture of bodily fluids, Padme curled up into a ball, placing her dripping face on Jabba's moist green belly. She was his now. He placed his right hand on her head and proceeded to comb his fingers through the matted texture of her saturated brown hair, the moistness of his hand making Padme's hair even wetter. Aurra Sing was pleased that Jabba was enjoying this tiny female that she had discovered. Yet she would be a liar if she were to say that she was not slightly jealous of the attention that the Hutt was giving the young creature. She leaped from the top of Jabba's tail and crouched down beside Padme. Looking deep into Jabba's curious eyes, she slid the long fingers of her right hand between Padme's slender legs and parted them so that the pretty pink butterfly at her groin was now visible. The sight of this alone caused thick creamy saliva to cascade from Jabba's jowls. Aurra began to rub the thickness of Amidala's pink clitoris with her forefinger. The young queen was still disorientated from the agony she felt previously in her behind, and whilst pleasured by the bounty hunter's actions, was not quite sure what was going on. Aurra then proceeded to place her two middle fingers into Amidala's waiting love tunnel. The queen sighed as she felt them press against her moist, pink velvet walls. Then Aurra maneuvered her remaining fingers into Amidala's Venus mound. Her thumb soon joined them, and gently Sing pushed the entirety of her hand into the queen's tight pink pleasure palace. The sensation of Aurra's hand inside her was enough to cause Padme to groan ecstatically.
Ooh.
Yet the pale-skinned bounty hunter was not finished yet, and she proceeded to tighten her fingers inside Padme until she had made a fist. The sensation of Aurra's knuckles rubbing against her sensitive vaginal walls sent Amidala into a spasm of pleasure, and she sighed deep sensational incantations of ecstasy at each flick of Aurra's wrist. Sing's hand was now awash in a vast cascade of Padme's young juices, which flowed onto the moist ground beneath them. This was getting all too much for Jabba. The Hutt couldn't wait any longer. He wanted this young human female here and now. Jabba pulled at Padme's chain, and the girl flew upright, landing on the width of his belly. Such was the force of this action. The queen was pulled clear of Aurra's clenched fist. The motion of Sing's hand being suddenly withdrawn from her tight vagina caused Padme to release a high-pitched scream. The young monarch's face was only inches away from Jabba's mouth, and the thick stench of his spice-strewn, fishy breath blasted onto her soft face. Amidala's tight little bosoms were pushed firmly against the river of creamy dribble that cascaded from the Hutt's mouth and over his belly. The warmth of this moisture caused her tight nipples to harden, and she could hear the thickness of the sticky substance as it oozed about between her stomach and his. He was warm, and after the coldness of the floor upon which she had been seated, this was a refreshing change. Jabba's tongue flipped from his mouth, and its pale, bubbled texture rolled down Padme's pretty young face. Her deep brown eyes were filled with his slimy secretions, and this made it difficult to see what was going on before her. Jabba licked her features with an even greater passion, spreading his dripping organs, caressed down to her breast, before moving further down and paying extreme attention to her tender belly. Jabba would not rest until every inch of this girl's skin was smothered in a sticky green love juice. The Hutt felt that the maiden was sufficiently lubricated and grabbed Padme's right wrist with his chubby digits and turned the girl round. Gripping the queen's left arm, he pulled her even closer to his oily green blubber. Padme's eyes opened wide with horror as Jabba's jowls opened and closed around her neck. All she could see was the darkness inside his mouth. The spicy smell within him was vile. Was his stomach her next destination?
No!
Jabba held her in this position for a moment, before Amidala felt the slippery moisture from about her master's lips. In this state of sensory deprivation, Padme had failed to notice Jabba's snaking tail, which was gently stroking the inside of her left leg. It was not long before it had reached her inner thigh. Padme's anus was still numb, yet she could feel the ribbed tip of Jabba's well-lubricated tail prizing apart her tight pale rectum, stretching its pink flesh with a pressure that the Gamorrean could only have dreamed of. Deeper the Hutt's tail probed, until its tip was almost exploring Padme's intestines. By now the young monarch had lost all sense of feeling within her behind, and only hoped that any pain would soon cease.
It makes me feel uncomfortable.
Gardulla the Hutt had been watching Jabba's activities inside the pleasure pit with pleasure. He had long wondered why a Hutt as great as Jabba would be so interested in soft pink humans when he could have any creature that he so desired. But even he was forced to admit that the small female that Jabba was currently occupied with was different. So young, so tender. Gardulla had never touched any female from the core worlds before. And this one that Jabba had claimed intrigued him greatly. Gardulla slithered over to where his fellow Hutt was so pleasuring himself. Gardulla opened his mouth and flicked his long bulbous tongue in the direction of Padme's crotch. The dripping organ licked at Amidala's bulging clitoris. Jabba felt the girl right about before him, and he was grateful for Gardulla's contribution. The thick globs of slime that Gardulla had secreted into Padme's front love tunnel had more than adequately lubricated the girl. The Hutt knew she was ready. The ragged surface of Gardulla's tail pierced Padme's tight vaginal lips, rubbing against her velvet red womanly walls. Padme's sweet juices bathed the Hutt's organ, and mixed with his thick slimy secretions to form a sticky cocktail of ejaculate. Gardulla continued to thrust his tail deep into the inner depths of the girl's virginal opening. Padme was stuck between two sensual extremes. In her groin she was receiving only pleasure, yet in her behind there was only pain. She couldn't focus on which was the most predominant, and in confusion, she lost consciousness. The two Hutts laughed aloud as they felt the thrusting of each other's gargantuan tails within the girl, and the swelling of juices within her. Their moment had come. Jabba climaxed first. His mouth opened wide in a vast river of his thick creamy ejaculate, thrust from within, and showered forth over Padme. The blast catching Gardulla, and a few of the crowd assembled around them as well. He was so drained that he dropped Padme, and she fell into the puddle of his rich green semen like a rag doll. Upon seeing the slime-coated girl helpless before him, Gardulla couldn't contain himself any longer. His lips opened in a cascade of his yellow-green love juice flowed over Padme's limp little form. Both Hutts belched in satisfaction. Their next problem concerned what to do with the lifeless queen in front of them. There was movement within her bosom, so she was still breathing. Jabba considered her a worthy conquest, and looked forward to pleasuring himself with this little woman again at a later date. If not, he knew there were other ways in which he could taste her tender flesh. He dropped her chain, gestured to Gardulla, and the two slithered away to experience more of what the various females assembled in the pleasure pit had to offer. Padme lay in the puddle of the rich, moist ejaculate for what seemed like hours. In time, the green river of slime around her hardened, and her aching body slowly returned to consciousness. She was alone. She was cold, and she was afraid. What had so possessed her to leave her friends, to wander down that dark corridor? Was her need for freedom from her commitments so great that it pushed her into an even more consuming servitude?
Yes.
Here she lay helpless, as the people of Naboo suffered at the hands of the Trade Federation.
Well, that smells stinkawith.
Damn her selfishness. Damn her curiosity. For all the pain she was feeling now, she deserved this punishment, for the greed she had placed before those she loved dearest. Despite her weakened state, she attempted to free herself from this cocoon state, but the tough residue from the Hutts was hard to break. The pit itself was now quiet, and there was a renewed darkness about it. A few drunken creatures still littered the concave structure, but the huts themselves were nowhere to be seen. Amidala had by now struggled enough to free one of her arms, but she froze solid when she felt the sensation of something or somewhere nearby. Padme could hear a sniffling, wheezing sound, coupled with a slow beating rhythm that could almost have been a set of bird wings, like those she often heard at the dawn of a new day on Naboo. The Queen looked down to see Watto, Anakin's flying insectoid slave master, hovering above her crotch.
Don't get me wrong, though.
His long protruding snout was smelling her Venus mound, and with deep sighs voiced his approval. She looked into his yellow eyes and sensing their desire, Amidala felt her heart sink at the prospect of having to endure more agony. "I was a-hoping to find you here, little miss," sneered Watto. "Your friend with the long hair has been looking for you, and I figured if he was going to rob me of my slaves, it was only right he should give me a new one in exchange. I already have several contacts who have shown interest in your, youthful body after they saw you coming out of my shop. You're, going to make me very rich, girl." Padme saw a shadow creep up behind her, and she presumed the worst. "I thought even you would not be as stupid as to cross paths with the Hutts," cautioned a gentle voice from behind Padme. An echo about the pit gave the voice a detached resonance, but its clear, precise vowels were easily recognizable as those of the Jedi Knight, Qui-Gon Jinn. His long sandy hair flowing in the breeze that whispered through the pit, Qui-Gon walked towards Watto. "I don't believe the girl was part of our bargain, Watto. Now go before I tell Jabba that you've been attempting to steal his property. I believe even you would not survive a visit to the great pit of Khartoon." Padme could see the frustration in Watto's face. He hung his head in shame, threw the Queen a spiteful stare, and flew back into the darkness. "I'm sorry it took me this long to find you, young handmaiden, but nobody had seen you disappear, and I couldn't go back to the Queen without you, could I?" Qui-Gon's words were patient and calm, yet Padme detected an air of sarcasm in his phrasing. "How badly have they treated you?" he inquired. "Bad," she replied. For a moment, she felt his mind touch hers. She felt his concern for her, his unconditional love for his Padawan learner, Obi-Wan Kenobi, his uncertainty about the task ahead. Yet, if she could feel this freely, the thoughts of a Jedi Knight, which of her memories were he privy to?
Thought that was forbidden for a Jedi.
"I feel your pain," he noted with a mournful ambience. "Nobody deserved what you've endured, especially one as noble as yourself. It will be difficult for you to forget these experiences, but in overcoming them, you will in time become strong. Please, I need your courage if we're ever going to free your world." Qui-Gon pushed aside the peasant's garbs he wore and pulled his lightsaber from his belt. Once the light, its vivid green glow, lit up the entirety of the area that surrounded him and Padme. The Jedi traced a line around Amidala's enclosed form with his blade. The Queen felt the looseness about her arms and body. She sat up as Qui-Gon finished cutting around her slender legs. Padme stood up and brushed the last of the Hutt's flaky secretions from her creamy skin. With appropriate modesty, the Jedi removed his long gray poncho and wrapped it around Amidala's frail, naked body. He picked up Padme's tired little form and cradled her in his mighty arms. Padme's tired brown eyes looked into Qui-Gon's worldly glare with an air of concern. "Not a word about this to the Queen, you understand?" Qui-Gon smiled. "I won't mention a word, Your Majesty." Padme smiled back at him in return. Together they journeyed into the blazing heat outside and the quest that lay beyond. The end. Thank you for listening to this bonus episode of WrestleRotica. May the 4th be with you. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please be sure to like, review, and subscribe to us on iTunes. Visit us elsewhere online, including Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Tumblr, and as always, our official website, WrestleRoticapod.com. May the 4th be with you.